Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation, presented by the President of the United States. A proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd of September, AD 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States, containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January AD 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforth and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such person, and will do no act or acts to repress such person or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January, aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the states and parts of states, if any, in which people thereof respectively shall then be rehabilitated, rebel against the United States, and the fact that any states or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections, wherein majority of the qualified voters such states shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such states and the people thereof are not in rebellion against the United States. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January, A.D. 1863, and accordance to my purpose, so to do publicly proclaim for the full period of 100 days from the first day above mentioned, other designated as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except parts of the parish of St. Bernard, Palcamus, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Terrebonne, Taffoch, St. Mary's, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Acme, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, which accepted parts of the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by the virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slave within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforth shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. I recommend that to them that in all case they, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such person of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garnish forts, portions, stations, and other places, and to men vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, I sincerely believe that an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon the military necessities, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. Now the footnotes. The Emancipation Proclamation arrived after Lincoln and his administration had worked for 2 years to end slavery, passing a series of legislations which progressed the agenda of abolition. The first tangible step occurred in August of 1861 when the U.S. Congress, at that point in the Union Congress, enacted the Confiscation Act, a law in which allowed the Union Army to take any Confederate property that would be of military use. Slaves counted as Confederate property, and so Union soldiers were able to seize slaves from their Southern owners and bring them to Confederate camps, where the slaves were given work. Further laws passed in March and July of 1862 intensified the effects of the Confiscation Act. These laws protected the slaves from the threat of being returned to their former owners and granted them full freedom and the right to serve in the Union Army. 2. Originally a noun, proclamation referred to a formal order publicly issued by a legal authority, later an acquired more general use. Referring to an authoritative declaration. In the United States, presidents frequently make proclamations, which Congress a presidential which are either ceremonial or substantive. Notably, without the authority of Congress, a presidential proclamation is not enforceable by law. With the exception of wartime, the president's role as commander-in-chief. These circumstances allow Lincoln to circumvent Congress and make this proclamation. 3. The noun wit refers to the facility of mind. Facility of the mind or someone's ability to think, reason, and understand. The verb form here introduces Lincoln's previous proclamation in order to inform audiences that they ought to be aware of the context which the final Emancipation Proclamation will be issued. Lincoln opens the Emancipation Proclamation by quoting himself. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln delivered a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation announcing the Confederacy his intention to free all Southern slaves. At the start of 1863, this document, the second and final Emancipation Proclamation, represents the fulfillment of Lincoln's intentions. 5. In July of 1862, Lincoln had completed a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation and showed it to his cabinet. William Seward, the Secretary of State at the time, thought it wise to refrain from delivering the proclamation until after the Union had scored a decisive victory in battle. Seward felt that the proclamation should be announced from a position of strength rather than weakness, and that it ought to be presented as genuine for American values rather than a calculated move to assist the Union war effort. Lincoln heeded Seward's appeal to deliver the proclamation after a military victory. The president unveiled the proclamation preliminary proclamation shortly after the Union defeated the Confederate at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. This initial proclamation was partially a military move. Lincoln's intention was to frighten the Confederacy with the looming threat of emancipation. His address offered Confederate states the opportunity to rejoin the Union and thereby avoid the eventual consequences of emancipation. 7. The adjective countervailing derives from the verb to countervail, which means that something is equivalent to another in value, or that one force has been balanced against another. Since it modifies the noun testimony, Lincoln is stating that without strong evidence against their allegations to the Union, such states are not considered in rebellion. The inclusion here of the paralethal phrase, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, possibly serving as an appeal to a particular audience member who would have sought evidence of treason. 8. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation through unconventional means and under unusual circumstances. Lincoln's intent was to alter the nation's laws on slavery. One obstacle to such change was slavery's legality under the U.S. Constitution, whose ruling may only be shared by the acts of Congress. Lincoln's solution was to issue the proclamation through the powers granted to him as commander-in-chief during the time of war. Lincoln's emphasized his own authority in issuing the proclamation in order to strengthen its effects. 9. In this paragraph, Lincoln lists specific areas in which the emancipation would take effect. The list consists of 10 Confederate states which had officially seceded from the Union. Because the proclamation functioned as a war measure, however, the list includes the parishes and counties within those 10 states which were loyal to the Union or were occupied by Union troops. These exceptions were to be left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued, which is to say that slavery would continue in those areas for the time being. Also excluded were 4 border states which Lincoln hoped to appease. Altogether, these various exclusions meant that 830,000 of the 4 million slaves in the South would remain slaves. 10. While the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by unconventional means, slavery would soon fully abolish. The aim of the proclamation, namely the liberation of slaves, was eventually coded or classified by Congress as the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in January of 1865, shortly before the end of the Civil War. 11. The Emancipation Proclamation became a foundational text and foundational movement in the American Civil Rights Movement. It marked the first major victory in the continuing effort to provide equal rights to Black Americans. In his seminal I Have a Dream speech in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began to refer to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, then in its centennial year. King remarked on the importance of Lincoln's address, but he emphasized the enormous work left to be done. 12. Lincoln has to state specifically that the executive government of the United States, with the power of the military, can enforce the freedom granted to the slaves in those states. This proclamation is not enforced unless it has been authorized by Congress. However, Lincoln uses his power to conduct the military in times of war to enforce his proclamation, and the states that are actively rebelling. In stating this, he enforces his proclamation by classifying the power that he does possess under the Constitution. By leveraging his power as Commander-in-Chief, Lincoln was able to free a significant number of slaves and paved the way for ratification of the 13th Amendment. With 13. With the widespread freedom of Southern slaves, there arose a threat of violent rebellions among slaves. In the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, some Southerners eventually accused Lincoln of trying to incite violence. In some cases, these accusations were well founded, and certain slaves did rebel against their owners. However, Lincoln foresaw such violence and attempted to prevent it in this paragraph, enjoining upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. 14. Now, in that paragraph, it mentioned Lincoln stating his plan to enlist free slaves to the Union Army. This plan would have a twofold effect. The newly freed slaves would receive employment. The Union Army would receive a much-needed replenishment of soldiers and workers. At the time, the idea of allowing Black Americans to serve in the military was unprecedented. This paragraph thus extends the range of rights granted to the slaves beyond mere freedom. 15. Lincoln states that former slaves could enlist in the military, a first for Civil War. Black soldiers had served in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, Union Generals John Fremont and David Hunter had issued their own proclamations that allowed emancipated slaves to serve. These proclamations were rejected by more senior generals, however. 16. The particle warranted refers to an act that has been approved, justified, or sanctioned by a governing body or authority. Lincoln concluded his proclamation by again emphasizing that Congress allows him this power. This move not only achieves his aim to emancipate the slaves, but also invokes the authority of the U.S. Constitution. And finally, 17. After Lincoln's monumental announcement, slaves in the South reacted to the news of emancipation in various ways. Despite the hope inspired by the Emancipation Proclamation, it was not yet obvious that the North would win the war. Still, many slaves took action. Some rebelled against their masters, others ceased their labor. Some fled north to safety or joined the Union Army. Some slaves were worried about these enormous shifts. It was not certain that they would find security as free citizens. given their lack of education and training. All in all, the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation decidedly favored the North, with large numbers of slaves abandoning their labors and joining the Union efforts. The balance of power leaned further toward the North. Now, you have some of these footnotes by Zachary, Al-I editor, Wesley, Al-I editor, Allison W.B. But yeah, that's the Emancipation Proclamation. And I will see you guys in the next one.